Grace, mercy, and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. How are you guys doing? It has been way too long since I've actually gone up and streamed. Of course, as you guys know, I am married now. So I've been married for a little bit over 3 months now. And so generally, I've posted a few things, did a few of the sorts. You guys know that I did a stream with God Logic and a few others while I was in London. But now I am back in my usual place, and it's time to get cooking. And of course, I am not alone on my return stream back. I have a very special guest, a good friend of mine, and of course, the author of my new intro. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stream, The Word and I.
How y'all
What's
doing?
good, brother? How you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Salam Mama see to everybody, man. I'm excited. I'm just here really as a student, and I just want to take notes and soak up all the information and the intelligence that this brother right here was about to drop on us. So I'm not probably gonna say much, but I'm gonna be writing and taking notes. But I'm honored for you to invite me, and I'm excited to be here.
Of course, man. Of course. You know we always here to help. And you know, like you always have a home here on the Black Doctor YouTube channel. This is what we do. This is what we're here for. And of course, we have the original Quran only Christian squatting up in the comments. We have our brother Chris, One Way Apologetic, saying, "Love my brother Black Doctor teaching. This is going to be good, indeed, sir. It's actually going to be really, really awesome." And of course, we have brother Scott saying, "Let's get it." And make sure you guys go out and share the stream. Make sure that everybody, as he says, gets in here. Make sure that everybody gets in so that they can know what it means to defend the Word of God and defend the veracity of His Scriptures, which is going to be the topic today. It's going to be awesome. And of course, we have our residential Roman Catholic with us, our beloved sister, pro life Chloe. She says, "Party at BD's." It's definitely time for that. And our brother Omar is here with us. I am so excited to have you. And then we have Miss Kenda 27. She says, "Supporting Black Doctor from the Congo." Wow, it looks like our channel is spreading out everywhere. Oh, this is actually really exciting. So, before we start everything, let's just go through some of the awesome stuff. Thank you for being here. If you could just like and subscribe, make sure that you like. If you like what I do here, please be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and actually share it out to people, so that they can actually know what it means to defend their faith, to know the truth of the gospel, and to know what they believe and why they believe it. And of course, if you have any questions on the stream or comments, please make sure to make them down in the comment section. We'll probably get it to them as get them to you as well. And of course, if you want to continue to support me, you can either join my Patreon. Likes and shares also work, and if you want to give me any super chats, that's also fine as well. Anything is appreciated. So we actually have a few more comments. Let's see. Oh yeah, you're right. Pro life Chloe, our author, pro life Chloe, is a residential Marianite Catholic, Eastern Catholic. Pardon me for the correction, but indeed. So what are we here for? Why do we actually have this stream going on? Um, well, the answer is kind of obvious depending on the title if you've actually seen it. If you clicked on this and haven't seen the title, number one, what's wrong with you? Number two, thank you for being here. It's really awesome to have you. But what are we here for? We're here to answer the question: are the four gospels that we have in our possession, truly anonymous? You see, we hear from our Muslim friends that we don't know who wrote the Gospels. The Gospels are anonymous. And they get this from atheists and agnostics and biblical scholars and things like that, or self proclaimed biblical scholars. And the question is whether or not that claim is true. So we're going to look at our sources look at the evidence that we have in our possession, and look at the reasoning that those who say that the Gospels are anonymous make in order to see whether or not the argument actually makes sense. Word and I, do you have any comments before we begin?
Oh no, not much. I'm ready. I'm ready to take some notes. I'm ready. I'm ready.
Swag, let's get to it then. So, the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at the arguments that are proposed, or the main two arguments that are proposed. And they are summarized in a document that I want to look at. This is actually called the anonymity of the Gospels, or the alleged anonymity of the Gospels, by Simon Gathercole. Simon Gathercole. Now, the question is, who is this guy? Why should we listen to him? Why should we care at all? Well, we should listen to him because he's a scholar. He's a pretty good scholar. Simon Gathercole completed his degree in classics and theology at Cambridge, and then pursued a doctoral research at Durham University under the supervision of James D.G. Dunn. Yes, that James D.G. Dunn, atheist New Testament scholar. With funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the German Academic Exchange Service, and Hatfield College. So this guy has a lot of people backing him. He also studied for short periods at the University of Tübingen, and the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And he was formerly a senior lecturer in the New Testament at the University of Aberdeen. So this guy, he's got some PhDs backing him up. This guy has some good scholarship backing him up. So let's look at his article on the alleged anonymity of the Gospels, and let's see what he says. He says, in discussing the argument of anonymity, he's going through those who make the argument that that the Gospels are anonymous. He's looking at current scholarship, and so he summarizes it in a lot of places here. And so he cites particular scholars, Kurt Aland, and let's see, and Horst Balls. Calm yourself. So he summarizes it here as well, not only with Allen and Balls, but he does Walzer and Baum as well. And he summarizes their arguments. He basically says this here. These scholars highlight the topics as a neglected one. Allen and Balls treat anonymity in relation to pseudonymity, or even within it, certainly the latter dominate. So basically, he's saying that people argue whether or not the Gospels are completely unknown or that these Gospels were given a false name. There's a debate about that amongst scholars. In Walter, and especially in Baum, however, anonymity comes of age as a freestanding topic. So first, what he did is that he discusses, how much anonymity is even discussed as a main topic in New Testament scholarship, and only now has it really come to the forefront. And so he summarizes it as this. All these scholars see the anonymity of the Gospels not merely as a publishing convention, but as a function of the self-effacing posture of the evangelists. He's basically saying that the reason why they would be called anonymous in their sense is that they want to take themselves out of the picture. Basically saying that the reason why these people believe it is because the authors want to take themselves out of the picture and make Christ as the forefront, which is fine. That's a good argument. But he also says the principal reasons adduced for the gospel's anonymity are the obvious absences of names within the text, as well as the lateness of the current titles. This is what they mean when they say that the Gospels were published anonymously. So let's recap just before we get into this too deeply. The argument that these scholars are making when they say that the Gospels are anonymous is based off of two things, and pretty much are defined by two things. Number one, the Gospels didn't say, I, John, I, Matthew, I, Mark, I, Luke, wrote this. And then secondly, they argue that the titles that are actually applied to these gospels are attributed later on. They're attributed or placed into the text in the 2nd century, long after the disciples were gone. That's the argument that they're making. That's the argument that they're making. However, there are a few people who disagree, and they argue in this way. There have been a few dissenters from this line of scholarship. Krusop and Silva Lake, for example, said of the titles, why should this testimony not be accepted? No reason has ever been shown for the view that antiquity tended to anonymous books. Is contrary to evidence. And it is most unlikely that the 2nd gospel, for instance, ever circulated without the name of Mark attached to it. Debelius and Moles comment that the dedication to Theophilus in Luke's gospel means that the name of the author can hardly be omitted from the title. And Luke's prologue demands a title with Luke's name, or else the first person references in Luke 1:1-4 would be left hanging. Baucham's surgical distinctions between the 2 Johns, as in John the Elder and John the Apostle, attested in the literature of the 2nd century, conclude of John's gospel that there is no evidence that the gospel was ever regarded as anonymous. Indeed, more positively, the 4th gospel was never anonymous. The most extensive protest against the anonymity theory is found in various studies by Martin Hengel, who argued that all the Gospels were initially circulated with the form Evangelion, Carta, Marcon, Lucon, Ioannis, etc., Matthias, etc. Hengel's arguments, some of which we shall revisit in due course, focus mainly on the practical necessity of the titles, especially in the institutions of the library, the book trade, and early Christian worship. So, we have two views. One that says that the Gospels are anonymous because they didn't have their names specifically saying that they did in the text, and that these names were apparently attributed to them much later. And then the other side that says, with the evidence that we have, how are we to say that they're wrong? Because there are multiple reasons as to why we can trust them. The evidence that says that the early church regarded anonymous gospels is nowhere to be found. It's not found in Greek culture either. So it would be ridiculous for the church to actually accept anonymous gospels. Does that make sense so far, Word?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, if you're building up a church from these writings,
Yep.
Why would you accept someone that's anonymous, that you don't know who wrote it?
Right.
It'd be like building your house on sinking sand, because eventually this would be a huge problem.
It's like you're literally just saying, well, says who? And when somebody reads the Gospels, they're just going to basically say, well, says who? Who's going to be the one to tell us that they were right? That's the question. And so I've recognized that I probably should have did this a little bit earlier. One of the things that I want to do for us is actually help you guys follow along here. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to post in the comments for everybody to see the document that we're reading so that we can read them together. So if you want to follow along, click the link down below in the comment section, and we're going to read together. It's basically story time with Uncle Jerry right now. So we're gonna read through all of these.
Do you think that the persecution of the early church have anything to do with not putting names to them?
There is
from a personal opinion.
Yeah, from a personal opinion, there could be. So when it comes to the reason why they don't have them, I would agree that it's because they want to take the focus away from them and not away from and towards Christ. But that also doesn't mean that we don't know, who the authors were, and especially like you said, for Jewish persecution, you can see that in sort of the how much information or how much personal information is given from the beginning of persecution in the writings of the Synoptic Gospels, and a little bit after that sort of persecution when John is in Ephesus.
John.
He adds a lot more personal information. He
Right.
talks more about the inner discussions between the apostles and Jesus and things of that nature. So and of course, he's with a lot of the disciples who have survived persecution, or at
Right.
least to that extent. And so, John particularly is there. Andrew, I believe, is still there as well. He's still alive, and so he's giving more personal information because there are a lot more of the disciples there to give their testimony. And so it can be persecution, it can be other things as well.
Yeah.
So before we continue, let's go over our super chat here. We got brother Scott with the awesome super chat. He says, take notes. And please do take notes. This is going to be awesome. Please, like I said, click the link in order to follow along, because we're going to go through some really awesome stuff here in this article. It's going to be great. So let's actually continue on. If you actually have the document in front of you, we're already on page number 5, if I'm not mistaken. And we're going to be continuing on to, here we are, point 1.3, Gospel Scholarship at Large. We'll go over here. The reasons for these judgments are the same two principal reasons that submerged in our survey of the specialist studies. Number one, the first is the lack of inclusion of authors' names in the Gospels. They themselves do not tell us who their authors were. Or, as some more crudely put it, the Gospels are not signed. Addition to this lack of self-reference is a claim that the kata titles, initially there was, from Watson, referred to as the anonymizing tendency in the earliest tradition. After that, the present titles probably were not added until sometime in the 2nd century, or even late in the 2nd century. We've already come across this argument. They were added when the Gospels began to circulate together and express traditions that were current at that time. Freed rightly assesses the majority view, indeed near consensus among scholars. Most New Testament scholars agree that the Gospels are anonymous, and that the present titles probably were not added until sometime in the 2nd century. So this is what the majority of the scholars say. This is what they theorize, basically. However, what this article is going to display, and what I hope to display, not only from a negative sense, but a positive sense, that this claim doesn't really have any water holding to it. It's not a wise decision or not a wise reason to say that the Gospels are anonymous.
Right. You took that out of my mouth, because I was gonna say, isn't that kind of just a lazy view or lazy academical process to determine if something is truly anonymous or not? Oh, just because they didn't write them, that means that write their name to them, that means that they're anonymous. That's kind of a lazy framework of determining whether something is anonymous or not.
Correct. And most, those arguments, in toto, are arguments from silence. They're arguments from silence. And they don't actually follow. Just because somebody doesn't write their name saying, I wrote this, doesn't mean that that nobody knows who wrote it. Like, for example, if I wrote a text to you and you know my cadence, you know how I speak, you know the words that I use, you know the language that I use, you could easily say it, even if I don't know what number it's coming from, or don't specifically sign that I wrote it, you would know that it comes from me. Like
Right.
For example, if you were reading a letter and suddenly hear the words communicatio idiomatum, or I am a patient man, or something similar to that,
That's
you're
what I
going to
was
immediately
thinking.
know that's Black
Yeah.
Doctor.
Yeah, that's Black Doc. Yeah. Right.
So the argument that, well, they just don't necessarily tell us what the names are. It doesn't mean that nobody knows who wrote them. Doesn't make any sense. So what this article is going to do is going to first attack those two presuppositions. The first argument that he makes is about whether or not the absence of the author's name in the text is all that significant. It's all that significant. And so he takes it down on two fronts. Number one, basically whether or not the authors or the Gospels are to be technical treatises or whether or not they're biographies. So first, he argues whether or not it's significant, whether or not these writings are or don't have any titles if they were technical treatises. We could treat this case briefly as it has been applied to Luke. Alexander, in her arguments for the prologue of Luke's Gospel as a scientific preface, mentions the absence of the name in it as a standard in non-feature technical handbooks. The appendix to an article on the subject, she gives full 4 examples of scientific prologues. For example, those to Diocles, Demetrius, Hero of Alexandria, and Galen. Of these authors, none mentions his own name except Diocles, who begins his treatise with an epistolary address. The absence of the name from such treatises, then, is unremarkable. And if Luke's preface belongs in this tradition, then the absence of a name from it should not arouse comment. So what Gather-Cole is saying here is saying that even if we accept that point, that the gospel authors don't specifically say, hey, I wrote this, according to the genre, it doesn't matter. If the Gospels, for example, Luke, is a historical treatise, then it fits within the rest of the genre for these guys to not say, hey, I wrote this. We know that. And it doesn't matter. The absence of a name should not arouse comment, but yet, for some reason, it does with the 4 Gospels, according to these scholars. So they're being inconsistent.
So basically, it aligns with similar writings of this style in that time period to not ascribe a name to it.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. And even if we take the presupposition that the Gospels never were produced with a name. Secondly, that's one, whether or not the genre of the Gospels are a technical treatise. Second, deals with the question of whether or not they're history. We saw in our own survey of the specialist studies above, Baum particularly maintained that histories written in Greek included their authors' names, and so the absence of such names from the Gospels is a startling datum. So that's the claim. The fountainheads of Greek history writings, Hecataeus, Herodotus, and Thucydides, announced themselves as authors in the prefaces to their works. Thereafter, there is stronger references among Greek historians for including names than in, say, technical treatises. Baum's statement that Greek historians generally did this, however, stands in need of correction. There are 3 witnesses in Baum's treatment of Greek and Roman literature that need to be noted. So he begins to analyze the assertion. Particularly with Jewish historians. First, there is a conflation of Baum's discussion of the inclusion of the name within the work, and B, the publication under one's own name. Baum's statement that Jason of Cyrene and Justus of Turibius, about whose works we know almost nothing, and other Jewish historians did not write their works anonymously is probably true, but confusing following a statement about Josephus's inclusion of his actual name in a preface which is part of his Jewish wars. We do not know if those other Jewish historians included their names in their work. So his claim is not based on actual evidence, it's based off an assumption. The second, more substantive difficulty concerns his assertion, quote, at the beginning or end of his prologue, the Greek historian would mention his name and his provenance, leaving aside the exaggeration about the frequency of the provenance. The statement is also an overgeneralization about the presence of the name. So basically, he begins to tear down this argument bit by bit. So he says the element, therefore, although one could talk about a possible tendency to include the name as an element of the prologue form in ancient historiography, the title of Earl's article on the subject, he is undoubtedly correct that minor variations, such as the position or even the inclusion of an author's name, were allowable. So even in historical treatises, it was allowable for a person to not have their name attached to it in the text.
So what I'm hearing is, Black Doc, long story short, they're holding a double standard.
Yes.
It's a double standard when it comes to these writings over the other early antiquity writings of similar, historians and authors of such, that it was never a big fuss that they didn't ascribe their names to them. But when it comes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's under a different double standard. Now they must have ascribed their names to it when there's not any evidence saying that, even though some of them did in certain writings, they did, like Josephus, he did ascribe it to the Jews' wars, he put his name on it, but for the most part, it's absent of authorship of most of these other writings.
Yeah, they don't have their names written down in the text, and that's okay. The people recognize that that's okay. He even points out, among Roman historians, one can find major figures failing to include their names, including Sallust, Livy, Tacitus, and Florus. Indeed, Herkomer notes that this is the norm. It was the norm for even historians to not put their names in the text that they're writing, even if it's history, because everyone would know who's writing it. Then we get to the last point, whether or not the Gospels are biography. We hear from our Muslim friends over and over and over again that the Gospels are biography, that the genre of the Gospel is biography. And we can grant that. It's okay. In some aspects, biography is a subgenre of historiography, but it is treated separately here because of the different ways in which the sphragus may or may not be employed, whether or not, the historical aspect of it can be employed. Moreover, it is probably true that the most popular view of the gospel genre, though not a consensus position, is that they most closely approximate to biographies. In this connection, it is important to note that Philo omits his name from his biography, oriented towards works on Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. Josephus's autobiography does not contain a preface mentioning the subject's name.
So his own autobiography, he wrote about himself. He didn't even add his name to it.
He didn't add his name to the preface, bro. So if absence of such a self-reference were a criterion for an anonymity, we would be left with the absurd result that Josephus's Vita was anonymous. Among well-known biographers such as Plutarch makes no mention of his name in his parallel lives. Of the biographical writings of Lucian, his name, his passing has his name, but as part of an epistolarian prescript. Somebody else wrote it down. Otherwise, Alexander the False Prophet, Antosaurus, and the biography of Demonax have no mention of Lucian's name in the preface. He goes over and over and over again that these people don't have the names attached to them. It's crazy.
It's crazy.
So here, he says, this article is not the place for arguing a particular case for the genre of the Gospels, hence the spread of treatments. But what emerges is that the absence of the name from a technical prologue, if that's what Luke says, would be entirely unremarkable. It's completely normal. If belonging to the historiographical genre, the Gospels might be regarded as rather coy examples, but are certainly within the acceptable spectrum of possibilities. it's still okay. Finally, if, as most maintain, they're the closest to being biographies, the absence of evangelist names should excite no comment at all. Such an absence is not remotely a curious feature.
So why we? So what? Basically, what's the big deal?
What we
Why
doing
is
here,
it such
man?
a big? What we doing here, man? Why are y'all throwing all of these anonymous gospels under the bus when it's acceptable for the time period that they was wrote in, and
Yeah.
especially biographical works? It wasn't uncommon. But when
Nope.
it comes to, I mean, anything but the Bible, anything but Christ, anything but Jesus, this is what is
Uh-huh.
reading at.
Exactly. It makes from a historical perspective and from the very perspective that these people are even talking about, it makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. So before we continue on to the conclusion here in this point, let's actually see who else is here. Brother DL's here. Salam al Masih to you,
Salam
Prophets
Masih,
Republic.
Brother DL.
And of course, our brother Amin is here as well. What is good, brother? I hope you're doing well. Hope married life is still treating you well. It's treating me well. I know exactly how you feel now.
He's probably ironing right now, so
Yeah, he's probably folding close.
folding close.
And of course, our friend Casper. Thank you for this, brother. This is what a lot of us have not been able to dive into deeply yet. And this is what I do it for. This is specifically why I do it for, in order to equip you guys to know why these arguments which we come across, they don't follow. They don't make any sense. And it's being inconsistent from how historians actually do their work. And get this. This is from a student of James D.G. Dunn. He's not specifically saying that the four gospels were written by the apostles. But what he's saying is, he's not making an actual assertion, but what he's saying is that the reasons for why people deny it don't make sense. You're going to have to find another reason to deny the gospels. You're going to have to find another reason to do that.
Exactly.
So let's continue with what he says here, what Brother Gathercole says here. The absence of a name within the body of an ancient work is entirely understandable because of all the other ways in which the author might be identified. There are, of course, numerous ways of indicating an author's name in or on a roll or codex outside of the work itself. There could have been other ways, for example, a superscription or initial title above the main body of the work proper. Or number two, in a list of the full contents of the work, as in like a table of contents, preceding the main body of a text. In the running header, or as an end title in a superscript, a subscript, or longer colophon appended after the end of a work. Some of these seem intuitively improbable, only coming later in the transmission of the gospel, such as 2 or along with 3, and 5, which are more allied in the codex form. So the gospels were originally written down in scrolls, and then later on, as they were transmissioned and of course compiled together, they were placed into codices and books, because that was how it was easily able to spread as one body. Instead of carrying like 4 books together, you could put them all in one codex. This is why, like, for example, Tatian's diatessaron is used so much in the early church, because not only was it a harmony of the 4 gospels, it was all kept in one codex. And it worked easily for worship. You would carry the gospel book in worship like you would carry the Torah book in procession. It worked for liturgical worship. And so it was easier for them to carry them all in one book. But before that, the original gospels were all written down in scrolls. So Moll seems to suggest the last option, that is, Luke's name must have been inscribed and attached to the physical book on the titulus, basically the part of it that would come out of the scroll, which would say what name it is. We of course do not know if or how many of these were used in the first copies of the Gospels. But the point here is merely to emphasize the irrelevance let me repeat the irrelevance of the fact that the author's names are absent from the prefaces of the Gospels. As Herkimer noted years ago, the introduction of titles and authors' names separate from the work itself are rendered superfluous, even if they did not eliminate the personal self-introduction. In overall conclusion to the second part, one can at least say that this is a category mistake to say that a work is anonymous because it did not contain with it the name of the author. As Simon Swain has commented about Greek and Latin literature in general, it is perfectly normal for literary works to begin without a reference to their author. The author's name should already be known to the reader or hearer from the usual devices. So what do we learn so far? To say that the four Gospels are anonymous because they don't have "I wrote this" is completely false. Because the absence of saying "I wrote this" is normal and irrelevant for documents during that time. Dims the facts, y'all. Dims the facts.
Yeah. It's just a big double standard. It's just a big stuff, and it is hyper skepticism. If at the least, it's hyper skepticism. They don't
Exactly.
want the Gospels to be true. So many, because a lot of these historians are atheists or have some other secret agenda, affecting
Yep.
their way of thought, their processes. They don't want the Gospels to be true. So they stoop as low as to say they're anonymous, even though I'm pretty sure 80 to 90% of them know that these other works of antiquity was not prescribed an author as well, as far as being on the actual codex or the actual manuscript.
Yep.
But they want to highlight that fact to make it look like, well, we don't even know who wrote these, so how do we know that these are true?
Correct. So let's see. Then he moves on to the second argument. The argument that the titles and names were later additions. If the first item of evidence for the Gospel's anonymity is insignificant, then what are the second challenging datum? The present titles probably were not added until sometime in the 2nd century. This again may well be true. Maybe. It is not clear that Mark added Evangelion Carta Markon as a prefix or suffix in his autographon. This observation, however, is also irrelevant to the question of whether there was some indication of authorship, not in the Evangelion Kata X form, in the paratext to the gospel compositions. Irrespective of whether the full title was absent, the author's name might well in any case may have been apprehended somehow. There are 3 ways to address the question of whether or not it was probable that there were indications of authorship from the beginning, namely, by arguments from practical necessity. Number 2, by the evidence of the earliest period for names being assigned to the Gospels. And number 3, we will offer some further corroborating evidence. So let's start with 1, arguments of practical necessity. In 2 cases, namely the importance of the titles for number 1, book trade, and 2, libraries, it is hard to see the significance for the period at the beginning with which we are concerned here. It is not until the 2nd century that appeal is made to the public availability of Christian books. So he's basically saying there are 3 particular settings that Hengel makes that would necessitate us actually having titles to these Gospels. Number 1, book trade, and 2, libraries. Those don't matter in the first 2 centuries of the church. So we don't need to worry about those at the moment. So remember, this isn't necessarily a conservative scholar because he's not trying to, not simply disagree with his contemporaries because they're either conservative or liberal. He's even critiquing his, I guess, more conservative fellow authors. So he's saying we don't necessarily need to know that, or that doesn't necessarily matter as a reasonable argument. Similarly, Christian libraries probably began around the same time, early in the 2nd century, although it is likely that some teachers and churches possessed a number of Christian books, and it is easy to imagine that they had any means of identifying the different volumes. They did have means for that. Potentially more significant is the third, the setting of Christian worship. I kind of want to stop right there and make a theological point that worship is essential.
Right.
Because it is worship of God is the center to what we as Christians do, and it's the center to what the church does, and it is the very means by which we can look to show the reliability of the gospels, because Christians would not use things that we do not know in worship.
Exactly.
I mean, this is what giving God who he is, giving God what he's owed, hearing God speak to us in the scriptures, and then responding with a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. You can't do that without knowing and understanding the worship that God has prescribed.
Yeah.
Now, I could go on and on, but I'll take off my Anglican cap and put back on my scholarly cap for this. Let's get back to the point.
So the first two is the book trade and the libraries, right?
Uh-huh.
So there wasn't enough of them to actually trade them, or thinking that they're going to grow in that fashion to even have to put a name to it, or was essential, right? And the libraries, it wasn't really,
they didn't
widespread
have
enough.
Yet.
Yeah, widespread enough to actually put them in, a chronological order or alphabetical order, so you can go and you can actually pull from, and you won't have to dig through a whole section of books, a whole bunch of scrolls and such like that. So it was started off so small that it wasn't no need, because everyone already knew who wrote them,
Sure. So the argument here is basically saying these things don't necessarily propose an absolute necessity for why the authors should have been found or the knowledge of the gospel author should be found in another way. So it's basically saying that, book trade, they weren't necessarily, going to trade all these books so quickly because they were under persecution. And they had libraries, but they didn't have these huge libraries to necessitate that they couldn't know which one they could have without a label on them. That's not the reason they would use to say that we absolutely need to know that the title is there.
Right.
But there is the third one. Worship is the one that provides a necessity to show that there are that the gospels have to have names on them, or that they know. So let's see at the point here. Hengel adduces, for example, the comment at the beginning of Melito's Parapascha. Side note, read Melito's Parapascha, his sermon on the Passover, or on Easter, basically, especially during Lent and Good Friday, and on the vigil of Easter.
Do they have this in like PDF form or something you can download?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
It's free. It's free.
I haven't read that.
Oh, dude, Melito of Sardis's Paschal sermon is beautiful. I actually quoted it in one of my Easter homilies a few years back, where he literally says that God was murdered, where he affirms the deity of Christ and the death of Christ in the same sentence, and then Christ rises from the dead, saying, "Who will contradict me?" That the resurrection is the defining moment of everything in Christianity. That if Christ is not raised, we're still in our sins. It's so good. It's so good, bro. I promise you.
When was this written? Just historical.
Melito of Sardis lived in the early first, late second century. Give me a second.
Oh, okay. So it's early.
Yes, it is very early. Like literally, when you're looking at Melito of Sardis, his document his sermon on Pascha comes up. He was born in 100 AD and died at 180 at the age of 80. So yeah,
okay.
second century.
Second century. Did he
Yeah.
put his name on it though, Black Doc? Did he author it? Because we don't know. It might have been anonymous. That
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. By the way, bless you, Albert. It's good to see you. And yes, it is me at long last. Salam al Nasi. Blessings to you, Crystals. Is God bless your family. Good to see you all here. And I just realized BB resembles E40. I don't know what that means.
you do look like the rapper E40. You do kind of look like him now. And
Oh,
as he said that, I was like, he do kind of remind you of E40 a bit. You
dang.
don't know who E40 is?
I just looked him up. I don't know if I should be impressed or offended. I don't know. I'm gonna have to look at I'm gonna have to look at his music though.
He's a legend. He's a legend. You put it like that.
Well, I appreciate that, dude. Let me see. Parapasca that Exodus has been read, and Luke 4, in which a scroll identifiable as that of Isaiah is handed to Jesus. Even here, however, a nameless title gospel would be sufficient as long as only one gospel was in use, just as Exodus was sufficient. Perhaps more important was the common sense speculation that when Gospels left their original context and were read elsewhere, it is hard to imagine that at least some hearers not thinking, says who? Who's saying this?
Right. Who said this?
We were just talking about this earlier. Hengel's point about anonymous writings potentially inviting suspicion is relevant here. Even before the presence of multiple gospels in one congregation, Christians might well have wanted to know where a euangelion came from. Hence, it is not necessarily the case that names must only have become a concern at the earliest when two or more gospels were gathered together, as Walter avers. I'm going to sidestep here, divert from the text a little bit, or divert from the document here to point out that the early church attests to this. The early church recognizes that they did not accept anonymous gospels from the very beginning. Let me point this out. Let me go to Tertullian. Tertullian, in his work against Marcion, so let me share this tab instead. Can you see this? Can you see this well, or do I need to zoom in a little bit more?
I can see it. I don't know about the chat, but yeah, I can see that good.
Yeah, let me see if I can zoom that in a little bit more, baby. Okay, let's go. Let's see. He says, Marcion, on the other hand, you must know, ascribes no author to his gospel. So here, if Marcion does not ascribe an author to his gospel, what do you think that Tertullian should say if the early church always accepted anonymous gospels? Should he just say, oh, wow, that's a problem? Or should he just say, okay, we have the same thing with our other gospels,
Yeah,
right?
that's what we have. So why would I make this a point to point out that Marcion has no author, which meaning the church didn't accept anonymous authors.
Yep. It's even worse. It gets even deeper because Tertullian just doesn't stop here. He says, as if it could not be allowed him to affix a title to that from which it was no crime to subvert the very body of Christ. And here I might now make a stand and contend, pay attention here, that a work ought not to be recognized which holds not its head erect, which exhibits no consistency, which gives no promise of credibility from the fullness of its title and the just profession of its author.
Boom.
But we prefer to join issue on every point, nor shall we leave unnoticed what may be fairly understood to be on our side. So he literally says, here's the standard. No one, and I mean nobody,
Nobody
accepts a gospel that does not have a name attached to it.
So this is Tertullian.
Yes, this is
Versus who?
Tertullian.
Who's he?
Marcion.
Marcion, right? Okay.
Yes, this is Tertullian in his book against Marcion. Let me get you the full designation of it for you, just so you make sure that you can actually pull this up yourself. This is Tertullian in his 5 books against Marcion. This is book 4, chapter 2, section 2. Book 4, chapter 2.
Chapter 2, section
and
2.
I'll put it in the comments for us. Let's see, Tertullian, Contra Marcion, book 4, chapter 2, section
and Tertullian,
2.
And Tertullian is like one of the Mount Rushmores of early church fathers, right?
Well, we don't necessarily call him a church father. He was not canonized as a saint.
Oh, okay,
but
okay.
He is a prominent theologian and a prominent apologist. He was a lay apologist.
Theologian.
And so he was later in his life, he ended up becoming a Montanist. But there is also believed later on in his life that he recanted from that. So he went into heresy and then came out of heresy.
I was about to say, so people will probably say, well, he's a heretic.
Well, he's a heretic. Not on this. Nobody said that he was a heretic based on his affirmation of the Gospels or in his doctrine of the Trinity. Nobody said that. Nobody implied that. It was because of his Montanism, his high. He basically became one of the early versions of like the hyper Pentecostals. Yeah, he was kind of weird like that. But nevertheless, in his defense of Christianity against the heretics, he's a powerhouse. He's a powerhouse. And he says here, now of the authors whom we possess, Marcion seems to have singled out Luke for his mutilating process. Luke, however, was not an apostle, but only an apostolic man, not a master, but a disciple, and so inferior to his master, at least as far subsequent to him as the apostle whom he followed. And that, no doubt, was Paul, was subsequent to the others. So that, had Marcion even published his gospel in the name of Saint Paul himself, the single authority of the document, destitute of all support from preceding authorities, it would not be a sufficient basis of our faith. There would still be wanted that gospel which St. Paul found in existence, to which he yielded his belief, and which he earnestly so wished his own to agree, that he actually on that account went up to Jerusalem to know and consult the apostles, lest he should run or had been running in vain. In other words, that the faith that he had learned and the gospel which he was preaching might be in accordance with theirs. Then, at last, having conferred with the primitive authors, and having agreed with them touching the rule of faith, they joined their hands in fellowship, and divided their labors thenceforth in the office of preaching the gospel, that they would go to the Jews, and St. Paul to the Jews and the Gentiles. Inasmuch, therefore, as the enlightener of St. Luke himself desired the authority of his predecessors for both his own faith and preaching, how much more may I not require for Luke's gospel that which was necessary for the gospel of his master? What does this mean? This means that just as Paul, even though he fully had the gospel, that as Paul says in Galatians, it was not taught him by man or through man, but through Jesus Christ, he received it from revelation. He then consulted with the apostles to make sure that he was not running in vain, that he was not preaching the gospel in vain, and they accepted him, gave him the right hand of fellowship. In the exact same way, a document that comes from the apostles is not accepted unless, number one, it has a name, and then number two, it is in agreement with the rule of faith, with the writings of the previous gospels. For example, if it's Luke, it has to agree with Matthew and Mark. They confirm the teachings of the Gospels. The Gospels confirm with one another. So if you have something, even with a name, it has to agree. But even if it doesn't have a name, it's not even considered. It's out of here. It's out of here. So Tertullian is affirming with what our author has said that the Gospels would never have been accepted without a name attached to them. Right?
Amen. Amen.
He then says, Gathercole then says, what has not, to my knowledge, been considered in the literature of this topic is the relevant of this point to the use of Mark by the authors of Matthew and Luke's Gospels. So here, what I love that he does here, actually, is that he takes the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis. Now, do you know what the documentary hypothesis is?
It's when like he's investigating, he's going around and interviewing all of these people, or exactly what? I'm just asking. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, well, no, the documentary hypothesis is basically saying that Mark is the one that was written first. And then Matthew, coming later, comes across Mark and then adds to it, basically making his own Gospel of Mark based off of Matthew. I mean, Matthew writes his own Gospel based off of Mark. And then Luke comes across both Matthew and Mark, and then writes his own Gospel based off of Matthew and Mark. So this is why some source critics theorize that the synoptic gospels are synoptic gospels, because they're copying off of one another. They're copying and editing one another. And so what Gathercole is saying is that even if you take this document, if you take this theory, you're going to have to say that the gospels cannot be anonymous. It is necessary that they had names attached to them. Why? He goes on to say, one could conceivably argue that both of these later evangelists were struck by the ring of truth in Mark's gospel, and so for that reason followed it closely. More probably, Matthew and Luke, for all their sense that Mark needed adaptation and expansion, followed Mark so closely in order and content because they had received reports about it which inspired some confidence. Minimally, this is likely to have been a name. A name. It is one thing to assume that Christians in a first century congregation who would simply have taken it on trust what they read out without asking the says who question. It is a considerable step beyond that, and beyond what I at least can believe, to suppose that a profoundly conscientious investigator like Luke would, without any accompanying testimony, follow by ancient standards very closely a naked anonymous account. It seems far more likely that Luke and Matthew would have received alongside Mark's gospel some statement, oral or paratextual, about what and whose it was. The first readers and audience of Mark's gospel would have known who wrote it. And the distance of time between Mark and his synoptic successors is not very great. Mark was rarely considered to be much more than 15 years earlier than Matthew and Luke. As we saw Walter noting earlier, it is not the case that the author wished to remain unknown. There is no evidence for a desire for self-effacing secrecy. So even if you're going to take the argument that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark, there would be no reason for them to actually want to copy from Mark if it didn't come with a name, if they didn't know who wrote it.
Right.
Why would random copyists copy from an unknown text that they believe apparently would be reliable enough for them to copy and get information out from? Does that make any sense?
No.
So even if you're going to take the argument against the four gospels that they're independent accounts, that they're all relying on one another, if they're relying on one another, they have to have a name attached to them. They have to know who they're writing from, because it would be stupid for them to copy off of something who they have no idea where it came from.
Right. And basically that last line, there is no evidence for a desire for self effacing secrecy. That would actually hurt them for wanting to be anonymous, then actually, promote it or make it trustworthy. It would have hurt their mission, basically, of writing these whole things if they kept themselves anonymous.
Yep. It's amazing. It's amazing. Then he goes in deeper. He says, we could look at this another way. Not from the perspective of Matthew or Luke's use of Mark, but from the angle of transportation of Mark's gospel. How did Mark reach Matthew and Luke? How'd they circulate? Books in the ancient world did not simply float around. I want people to recognize that. Hey, listen to me. I want you to recognize this. Documents in the ancient text, in the ancient world, didn't just simply float around. They were passed on by reliable people because they knew who the authors were. They didn't just float around. They were copied by trained scribes and would have been carried transprovincially by trusted people. This is why, in, for example, the writings of Paul, he lists the people who are going to be receiving the text and the people who are delivering the text. Right? This is why a lot of the latter parts of Paul's epistles have the salutations. This person greets you. This person greets you. This one's coming to you. So that you might know the trusted people who are receiving this letter, so that you might know that this is not coming from a person who you don't know. Right? This is why he says, for Matthew, and let us say Antioch, to have gotten hold of Mark, written, let's say in Rome, the text must come either directly or indirectly from Rome to Antioch. It is likely that not only the initial audience and the first readers of Mark would have known the author's identity, but also the early copyists and carriers. Again, the distance in time between Mark on the one hand and Matthew and Luke was not very great. They knew what they were receiving and who they received it from. Hello?
They were contemporaries. They knew exactly who wrote these.
Exactly. Oh, man. So there's the argument to the necessity of the Gospels textually. We could also point out, just simply from the textual critical perspective, that there is no text of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John where a superscript should be there that disagrees. That Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. From a textual standpoint, it's all there. But let's go to my favorite part. The attestation from history, the early evidence and attestation for the named evangelists. So he says, for the purpose of the arguments here, by contrast, named testimonia are what are needed. Although in some cases the arguments rely also on indirect evidence for a work's attestation of a named gospel author. Working backwards from the rather arbitrary date of the end of the second century it is potentially misleading to present Irenaeus as a novum, as an innovator, because he is merely one of the several second century writers known in the evangelist names. We will also introduce here two testimonia that are not regularly noted in these discussions. So, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the evidence that we have that attests to the gospel writers. Let's begin. The first two testimony we can denote might well derive from the 2nd century are two manuscripts. Number one is P66, which attests the title of John's Gospel, Evangelion Carta Eonen. So here, in early 2nd century, late 2nd, early 3rd, I think they're being charitable here, attests the title of John's Gospel. Secondly, a flyleaf amongst Papyrus 4 fragments may also date to the late 2nd century, though it may also be from the 3rd. It also reads, Evangelion Carta Mattheon, the Gospel according to Matthew. The rest of the evidence comes from 2nd century literature, broadly understood to include letters and other documentary sources. Number 3, fairly securely dated right at the end of the 2nd century, and in one case into the 3rd, are the letters of Clement of Alexandria in his statements of the evangelists as gospel writers. Earliest references to these authors are the Gospels of Matthew in his Stromata, Mark, Luke, and John. So Clement of Alexandria acknowledges the 4 Gospels, or the evangelists as the 4 Gospel writers. There are several other references specifically to John from around this time, which identify John as the beloved disciple who reclined at Jesus' side, and therefore as the author of the Gospel. One of these has, to my knowledge, hitherto been missed. This is interesting. In a scene in the Nag Hammadi Acts of Peter and the 12, Jesus gives the apostle a pouch of medicine and tells them, heal all the sick of the city who believe in my name. Not being medically trained, the disciples are baffled by this. Peter does not want to ask Jesus how this could be possible, so he signals to John, who is next to Jesus, and tells him to ask Jesus about it. John then does so. This scene seems to recall John 13, where the apostles are also baffled by what Jesus has said. And there too, Peter does not ask Jesus himself for an explanation, but motions to the beloved disciple who is next to Jesus to ask him, which the beloved disciple then does. Seeing John as the one beside Jesus, the Acts of Peter and the 12 Gospels, the 12 apostles, thereby sees John as the beloved disciple and therefore the author of the Gospel. So get this. Even the Nag Hammadi Gnostic text affirms the Gospel of John as a gospel and John the evangelist as its writer, the one who leaned upon Jesus' breast. Then, 5th example, the Quartodeciman controversy about when to celebrate Easter. Polycrates of Ephesus wrote a letter to Victor of Rome, the Pope of Rome, or the Bishop of Rome, stating that the Paschal feast should always be celebrated on the 14th day, the 14th of Nisan. He writes of various local luminaries buried in Asia who observed this practice. One was John. Here identified as the beloved disciple who reclined on the Lord's side, and therefore also is the author of the 4th Gospel. He says, quote, in addition, there was also John, who reclined on the Lord's chest and who became a priest wearing the mitre. He was a bishop and a witness and a teacher. He sleeps at Ephesus. He resides at Ephesus. So Polycrates, on when to celebrate Easter, says that it should be celebrated always on the 14th day of Nisan. Why? Because it was practiced by the Apostle John, who was bishop at Ephesus, who reclined upon his chest and sleeps in Ephesus, the writer of the Gospel.
So let me get this straight, Black Dot. These same Gnostic texts that these guys be trying to use against us actually ascribe that John was the one who wrote John, basically.
Yes, specifically the Acts of Peter and the 12.
Polycrates
Polycrates is a Christian, and he's discussing with the Bishop of Rome on when to celebrate Easter. And he's using as his evidence the practice of John, who was bishop in Ephesus,
to know when we should celebrate Easter on the 14th.
Yes.
Okay.
And he points out that this is the same John who leaned upon Jesus's chest. So he knows when and where it happened. He lived it. And so he continued to practice it in that way. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So let's carry on here, because this is some great stuff. The Muratorian fragment refers to Luke and John by name, but since it names them as the third and fourth evangelists, it is all but certain that Matthew and Mark are mentioned in the lost section preceding. Let's actually read the Muratorian fragment on this issue, because I love what it says here. I love what it says. Let's share this tab. Let's see if we can. There we go. Here we are. Yet he had not. Here we go. Let's see. The third book. This is when the narrative begins. The third book of the gospel is that according to Luke. Luke, the well-known physician after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken with him as one zealous for the law, composed it in his own name according to the belief. Yet he himself had not seen the Lord in the flesh, and therefore, as he was not able to ascertain certain events, so indeed he begins to tell the story from the birth of John. The fourth of the Gospels is that of John, one of the disciples. To his fellow disciples and bishops who had been urging him to write, he said, "Fast with me from today to 3 days, and what will be revealed to each one of us, let us tell it to one another." In the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should write down all things in his own name, while all of them should review it. And so, through various elements, may be taught in the individual books of the Gospels. Nevertheless, this makes no difference to the faith of believers, since by the one sovereign Spirit, all things have been declared in all the Gospels concerning the nativity, the passion, the resurrection, his life of his disciples, the twofold coming, the first in lowliness when he was despised, which is taking place, and the second glorious and royal power, which is still in the future. What marvel is it that if John so consistently mentions these particular points also in his epistles, saying about himself, what we have seen with our eyes and heard with our ears and our hands have handled these things which have been written to you. So even the Muratorian fragment notices the authority and the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but also the Johannine apostleship or authorship of the Johannine epistles, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John.
Wow.
And it even tells us that it was a group gospel. It was written by John, but it's the testimony of all the other apostles that were with him. This is why in the New Testament, in John, you have the we passages.
Mm-hmm.
What we have seen with our eyes, which we've heard with our ears and seen with our hands, we have seen his glory. It's talking about him and the other disciples, including Andrew. That's so cool,
man. Yeah,
right?
I haven't never read this Muratorian fragment either.
Oh, bro, you know.
I need
what
to
I'm
read
actually going to do in the description after this is that I'm going to edit the description so I can put all the documents here, because I want to make sure that you guys have all of this, that you have all the documents. It's so good. It's so good.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's go back to the point, because we already looked at the Muratorian fragment and where it attests the Gospels. Share this tab instead. Irenaeus, we've talked a lot about Irenaeus before. Everybody who knows my previous presentations on the authorship of the Gospels know that I always start with Irenaeus. I always start with him because in his Against Heresies, book 3, chapter 1, he lays out the four Gospels, the authors of the four Gospels, when and where they wrote, you know? And so he talks about that. Irenaeus' writings refer several times to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. For example, Against Heresies, book 3, chapter 1, verse 1. In Irenaeus, we have also clear connections between these authors and the Gospels, which we know under these names because he refers to the beginning of each Gospel in connection with each name. That's book 3, chapter 11, section 8. He actually lists the beginning of each Gospel and points them out by name. These are the Gospels. Here's the beginning of them, and here's the writer. We know who they are. We know who they are. An indisputable testimonium to John's authorship of the fourth Gospel appears in Theophilus of Antioch in his Autolicum. He says, "Therefore, the Holy Scriptures teach us, as do all those inspired there by the Spirit, one of whom John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God." So what is Theophilus quoting?
That's John 1:1.
Right. And who does he say John 1:1 was written by?
John the Apostle.
Yeah, John the Apostle. That's right. That's right. And so he goes on to say, Hill, following Lawler, notes an interesting passage from a historical epitome, citing Hegesippus. I can't get his name right. Which is relevant for our purposes because it names John as apostle and evangelist in the sense of gospel writer. He says, Domitian, son of Vespasian, displayed many evils against those in office in Rome, and beating Nero in cruelty, he was the second to institute a persecution against Christians. At that time, he imprisoned John, apostle and evangelist, on Patmos. So, Hegesippus notes that John was the apostle and the evangelist, and he was on Patmos.
That lines up with the Bible, don't it?
Mm-hmm. that John, the apostle and the evangelist, that he was the one who wrote the gospel, and get this, Central Dawa, was the one who wrote the book of Revelation.
Yeah, that was new.
So here we have continual evidence that John is the writer of the Gospel of John. Lawler argues persuasively that a direct literary relationship between Eusebius and this epitome is unlikely, and that both are dependent on Hegesippus. In the preface to the Chronicon Pascal, the Peripasca by Claudius Apollinaris of Hierapolis, this is cited. There are then those who out of ignorance stir up disputes about these things, even if what they do is pardonable. For ignorance does not deserve condemnation, but needs instruction. And they say on the 14th day, the 14th day of Nisan, the Lord ate the lamb with the disciples, and he himself suffered on the great day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They explain that Matthew says this, or that Matthew says this, or so they think. Therefore, it is case both that their opinion disagrees with the law and that the gospel seem to contradict them. Apollinaris here opposes the view, apparently based on the synoptic chronology, especially in Matthew, that Jesus ate the Passover with his disciples on the 14th of Nisan. Elsewhere, he maintains that Jesus died on this date. So here, he points out that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew because he says, Matthew says this. Or they think Matthew says this. So even the heretics agree with the Christians that Matthew wrote Matthew.
Yep. Even though he disagrees on the actual date that he was crucified from what I gather from this.
Right. The heretics were making the argument that Jesus ate on the 14th day of Nisan and was not crucified on this day. That the 14th of Nisan was not Good Friday, but Maundy Thursday. And Apollinaris is going against that because Matthew says and agrees with John that the 14th of Nisan is Good Friday and not Maundy Thursday. Right? So he's not disagreeing that Matthew wrote Matthew, and he's not even disagreeing with what Matthew says. He's disagreeing with the heretics' misunderstanding of what Matthew says. And then we have the apocryphal Acts of John. Like Polycrates and the Acts of Peter, it shows acknowledgement of the tradition that the beloved disciple was John, the son of Zebedee. Heraclion comments that John 1:18 is spoken, that is, no one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten God, which is at the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. That text is not quite as was spoken not by John the Baptist, but by John the disciple. It is not quite certain, as Gunther claims, that Heraclion attributed the gospel to John, the disciple of the Lord, but it seems probable that he avoids calling either John the Baptist or the evangelist John to avoid confusion, especially given that John is what Heraclion generally calls the Baptist. But he still affirms that it is done by the disciple of the Lord, John, the disciple of the Lord. According to Irenaeus, the exegesis of John 1 by the Valentinian theologian Ptolemy consists in an exposition of how the Father emanated all things spermatically. So even the heretics affirm that John was written by the gospeler, by the evangelist, John the apostle. So let's see. Another neglected testimonium, I think this is really interesting, is the probable allusion to Matthew the evangelist in the Gospel of Thomas. The view that this is a reference to Matthew the evangelist is now has considerable scholarly support. So even other scholars affirm that the Gospel of Thomas might be referring to the Gospel of Matthew. It's interesting. He goes on to say, a lengthy case can be made elsewhere, but the key point is here that Matthew seems to be an authoritative spokesman alongside Peter, who needs to be rebutted by the Gospel of Thomas. The reference to Matthew here also appears in a logion heavily influenced by Matthew's Gospel. So they affirm that the Gnostics affirm that Matthew is a Gospel writer. And then we get, of course, the use of Papias. If you, I could talk about this. I could talk about Papias and go through it, but we've already spent like almost an hour and a half already. So we're gonna skip through a good amount of it here. But where is the put here? Here we go. The question arises: Papias's date. The point thing here is that Papias actually refers to all four Gospels, if I'm not mistaken. He refers to all four Gospels. Eusebius prefaces the quotation of Mark's authorship with "This is what the elders said," things of that nature. Here's the summary. Taken in all, the first 2 centuries CE are populated by a good deal more reference to the Gospel authors than is commonly appreciated. The most common attestation is to John and Matthew in the top 2, with Mark and Luke in the lower tier. Facts which roughly dovetail with the evidence from the papyri, as well as with the relative frequency of biblical quotations from the period. So here we have an analysis of all of them. So Clement refers to all 4. Polycrates refers to John. The Muratorian fragment refers to all 4. Irenaeus against heresies refers to all 4. And Papias refers to Matthew, Mark, and John, and there's a possibility where he does not do Luke. So here's the evidence that we have. We could go even more. Like once I get the documents in the description, we could literally go bar for bar for each of these authors, each of these people who are attesting to the authorship of the four Gospels. We already looked at the Muratorian fragment. We can also look at Origen in his canon list. We can look at Tertullian in his canon list. We can look at Irenaeus in his canon list as well. We can look at all of them. This is why Origen says in his commentary on Matthew that there is no disagreement with any of the churches under heaven. Not a one. Now, then, Gathercole makes a point where he says he calls it an argument from silence. I don't, because I think it's a response to the argument from silence made by our other self-proclaimed biblical scholars. He says, two silences constitute important confirmation of a negative kind. First, there is never any sense among second century authors that the Gospels are anonymous. Let me repeat that. There is never any sense among second century scholars that the Gospels are anonymous. In fact, as I just quoted from Origen, it is unanimous in all the churches under heaven. No one disputes this. It's undisputed. Word, you were going to say something?
No, because I'm just wondering exactly when did this become a point of contention? Was it early, or is it just more modern? Because from what we're reading, all of the earliest documents never made a fuss about this. They all attested to who wrote the Gospels.
You know what? Historically, the first person to even imply that the Gospel authors weren't written by their attributed people was Faustus, the Gnostic heretic Faustus. You know when he lived?
When exactly?
In the 600s, in the 7th century.
Coincidence?
Coincidence at the time of Muhammad? I think
Muhammad, not. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is that a coincidence or?
I don't know, man. I don't know. But here, Augustine actually replies to this. He says, let me share my screen here. This is Augustine in his Contra Faustus. He actually points this out. He says, you set aside argument on the question of the true account to be given of Jesus and refer to what he says of himself and what the apostles say of him. And yet, when I begin to quote the gospel of his apostle Matthew, where we have the whole narrative of Christ's birth, you forthwith deny that Matthew wrote the narrative, though it is affirmed by the continuous testimony of the whole church from the days of the apostolic presidency unto the bishops of our time. What authority will you quote against this? Perhaps some book of Mani, where it is denied that Jesus is born of a virgin. As then, I believe your book to be the product of Mani, since it has been kept and handed down among disciples of Mani from the time when he lived to the present time, by a regular succession of your presidents. So I ask you to believe the book which I quote to have been written by Matthew, since it has been handed down from the days of Matthew in the church without any break in the connection between that time and the present. The question then is whether we are to believe in the statements of an apostle who was in the company of Christ while he was on earth, or of a man away in Persia born long after Christ. Augustine gets it.
Man, don't this sound like us? Don't this sound like us on the lives and the streams and arguing against the Muslims? This is exactly what we quote. This is like almost verbatim what we say.
Yep. It's like you say Matthew didn't write Matthew, and it's because of your theological reasons, your own theological convictions. You want to say, I want to quote what Jesus said, what Jesus taught, and what Jesus did. And so when we go to the Gospels, you say, oh, no, that's corrupted. Why? Because it disagrees with our beliefs. All right, then. What I want you to do is disprove the authenticity or the succession of the Gospels. Who are we
Right.
going to believe? The Gospel of Matthew, written by an apostle, passed all the way down through us through unbroken succession? Or are we going to believe a man in Persia from hundreds of years later with no actual connection to Jesus at all? Who are we going to trust? And in the exact same way, it's the same way for us. Who are we going to believe? Are we going to believe the four Gospels, those who actually lived during the time of Jesus, or are we going to trust an illiterate man in Arabia, hundreds of years away from the event, hundreds of miles away from the event, with no actual connection to Jesus? Who are we going to believe?
And this is interesting because it never makes that claim within the Quran or the Hadith literature that the Gospels were anonymous. Not that I've
Correct.
seen. If
No,
anything, I've seen confirmation of them so it has to. When did that even come a thing about in Islam? Because they getting it from somewhere else. They're not even
they're
getting it from
they're
their own text.
they're copying the arguments from they're copying the arguments from these
From Faustus and
liberal,
such.
yeah, these liberal scholars, because that's not an argument they make on their own. They don't read the Gospels. They don't. They literally take from atheist arguments because they're the ones actually reading our books and trying to attack the book. And so, if anything tries to make the Bible look bad, they just steal it and claim it as theirs. You made this? Nah, I made this. I made this argument against the Bible. Wallahi for Islam. This is what they do. This is what they've always done. Because nothing in their religion is actually, actually credible on their own. Like literally, as we see in the Quran, most of their stories, Jewish fables, Christian fables, pagan fables. Anything that actually comes from Islam is disgusting. It's where you get child marriage from.
Yeah.
It's where you get beating your wife from. It's where you get the claim that water is never unclean by anything. So you can do voodoo in like period water.
Dead dogs and and dead dogs floating all in the water. Crazy.
And where you get the claim that the sun sets in a muddy spring. This is what they get. This is what they get it from. And then it even goes to the argument about whether or not we should properly say one gospel or multiple gospels. Mentioned by second century authors of the gospel, singular, does not imply anonymity or lack of knowledge of author. Talk of the gospel goes side by side with references to the evangelists widely in second century Christianity. Justin uses both the singular and the plural, as well as implying that he knows some attributions to the evangelist. Irenaeus can also use the singular alongside the plural. Polycrates knows John as an evangelist, but also talks of keeping the Passover on the 14th day in accordance with the gospel, never deviating from it, but following the rule of faith. The gospel here not being a specific one. Theophilus talks about particular evangelist writing, but elsewhere can refer simply, without reference to the evangelist names, to the Gospels, or the Gospel voice, or the Gospel. The absence of any sense in the second century that the Gospels are anonymous means that Balcom's contrast between Hebrews and John applies to all the Gospels. No one can ever say, to mutilate Origen's famous remark about Hebrews, who wrote the Gospels, only God knows. Nobody can say that. Nobody. That's powerful.
Man. Yeah. I see my list of books just got so much more extensive that I need to read. Like
so and so what he does in the latter part of it is he compares the attestation to the author of Hebrews. In some of the earliest state, in some of the second and third century, there was some debate on whether or not who wrote Hebrews. A lot say that it was Paul. Some say that it was Luke. Some say that it was a sermon by Paul written by Luke. Some say that it's other people. There's some disagreement there. There's some difference there. But you don't get that with the Gospels. There is no one who disagrees. This is why whenever somebody says, oh, people disagreed on when Muslims say, oh, people disagreed on the authorship of the Gospels, the church fathers disagreed. Name one. This is what I asked them. Name one. Because I know for a fact that they are just simply repeating claims and not actually showing proof. Because they have no proof. That's the crazy part of it.
I needed this, Black Dot. I did. Like, I needed this. Like, I didn't have any doubts, and I knew about half of what you showed me, you know. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we got some things in our arsenal right now. Like, you're equipping us with this good stuff, man. This is good stuff right here.
And it's crazy. It's crazy. It says these 2 points are, of course, arguments from silence, but the silences are significant. They fit with the hypothesis that the names are attached to the Gospels is very early, but sit uncomfortably with the line that these names are late. The later that one views the attributions to be, the harder these silences are to explain. A good deal of foregoing argumentation has been negative. This is because the first plank of the positive case for anonymity made by so many, that is, the absence of the author's names, is completely insignificant, even found in the case of histories written in Greek, where the name is perhaps most frequently found in the preface in the work, but there is by no means anything approaching to a rule to this effect. In consequence, it is a pointless exercise to try to give a theological rationale for why there is no self-reference. And then, as we see, the claim for anonymity is not backed up by attestation. There's a reason for the names to have been known. A reason for the names to have been known. In addition to all the early references to the evangelist names, there is the difficulty of imagining Matthew and perhaps Luke accepting the second gospel on trust without accompanying testimony. And also, finally, the important silences. To follow up on the individual gospels, we have noted that attribution of the second goes back to John the Elder in the 1st century. That's the one Papias. But here's the summary here. This cannot be more than 20 years after the composition of the gospel. In light of this, it seems extremely to Matthew are both early and scattered. It's everywhere. Papias and the Gospel of Thomas are notably early witnesses to Matthew. And again, there are only 30-odd years between Matthew and Papias. Luke, on the other hand, is not attested as an author so early. In fact, not so before Irenaeus and the Muratorian fragment, whichever came first. However, of all the Gospels, Luke is perhaps the least likely to be anonymous, given the first-person references, dedication in the preface, as well as in Acts, and the we passages. John, the evangelist, has the greatest attestation of all the Gospels in the 2nd century. So even then, if you just want to pick one gospel with unanimous consent, it's John.
It's John.
It's John. They all say that John is the gospel of Jesus. Heck, let's even go to your Quranic sources. Ibn Ishaq says that it's the gospel of John.
Mm-hmm.
Even the Islamic sources say that the gospel which was given to Jesus is the gospel of John. And it has the most attestation.
And do you find it weird that that's the one that they attack the most for some reason?
Yes.
It's the most attested to, but that's the one that they pick out the most. And the one that they least attack is Mark, because I think most of them agree that Mark was the earliest. But
yeah,
John,
they proclaim that Mark was the earliest, even though it's the second.
Yeah, this is what they say. Mark was the earliest, but It wasn't. It was Matthew.
Right. They're holding to another theory of Markan priority because of the documentary hypothesis. They say because Mark is shorter and quicker, that it should have been done first, that it obviously was written first, and then Matthew and Luke sort of copy from it.
Copy from him. Yeah.
Right. So they're repeating off of theories.
But how can Matthew copy off of Mark when Matthew wrote his first?
Exactly. Exactly. But even then, taking that perspective, as we just saw from Gathercole, you would have to know that Mark wrote Mark in order for Matthew to copy it.
Yeah.
So it says, across the theological spectrum, from the Valentinians, the Gnostics, to the Acts of John, to the Acts of Peter and the 12, to Irenaeus, Theophilus, Polycrates, and reaching as far back as the time as Papias. Everyone agrees. It is the purpose of this article, not that these figures actually wrote the Gospels, but that the names are probably original. In light of these arguments, other hypotheses will have to be ventured besides anonymous publication. So basically, Gathercole is saying, I'm not making the positive argument that the Gospels were written by the apostles, but the evidence is there. And if you're going to deny the apostles, or you're going to have to deny that the apostles wrote the Gospels, you're going to have to find another argument than saying that they're anonymous. Because they ain't.
No.
They ain't.
The farthest from being anonymous. This like the... How can we... Oh, man. Because people need to know this. Even though I know probably most of the Muslims probably not going to buy it, but a lot of Christians need to know this specific details and how much attestation it is within the early church, early gospels, early, just everything that's early, first, second century, all of these sources that attest to this. Like, Christians need to know this, because they need to know, because I get to a certain point, apostolic succession, Polycarp,
we can talk
John,
about
the whole thing, you know what I'm saying? And they attested to it.
Yeah.
But as far as some of the Gnostic writings attest to these early gospel writers, and I think I don't know how we can get this out to more people, but I know if anything, I'm gonna start referring people back to this video so they can get this knowledge that you've been dropped on us.
Please do, brother. I mean, this is what it's here for. This is really what it's here for. I'm actually gonna either put it in the comments, put sources in the comments, or in the description for all of these sources that I'm going to look at, because we're going to look at, we've looked at this document, and I have a whole list of documents from the early church fathers on that the Gospels were never anonymous, that they affirm the four Gospels, and through the apostolic succession list that show us that we can trace it, like Augustine did, from the bishops from in his time all the way back to the apostles. They all could trace them down. And this was the reason why we could trust the claims that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because they handed their Gospels down to their trusted successors. And the successors sent it to their successors. The successors sent it to their successors. And down and down and down we go. Apostolic succession paved the way to preserve the New Testament text. As Brother Steve Boyce says, this is why I'm a Christian. One of the reasons why I'm a Christian. This is also one of the reasons why I'm an Anglican. Just to slide that a little bit here, because the episcopacy is one of the reasons why we can trust that the Bible that we have today is reliable. It is a living attestation to it. This is why I am confident, and why I'm so glad that I can trace my bishop's apostolic succession back to Peter. And our archbishop can be traced back to Peter, John, and Mark and James. So we have a reason for the hope that's within us, boys. We do.
Right.
And it's provable. It's provable. To say that the Gospels are anonymous is completely bogus. And so you
Yeah.
can trust that the gospel is true. You can trust what the gospel says is true. That Christ, who is truly God and truly man, loved you to the extent that he would come down and live a perfect life which you can never live and dies the death that you deserve. That the message of the gospel is true, that you were so sinful that that it necessitated the death of God on your behalf. But you are also so loved. You are so loved that God did not spare his own son for him to have you back.
Amen.
And you can trust that that message is true and that the writers of that message are knowable and trustable, untrustworthy. You can know that. And you can know that if you repent and believe in Jesus Christ, you will find him to be a perfect Savior. That's what all this information is telling us. This is the proof that that claim is true. That you can trust what the Gospels say and you can trust what Jesus says. Because Jesus says, whoever hears them, hears him. And whoever hears him, hears the one who sent him. You can trust when Jesus says to you, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest.
Give me rest. Amen. It give me goosebumps, bro.
Oh,
For
that's the
real.
power of the gospel, bro. You can't get anything but, dude. This is the truth. This is the proof that we have at our disposal. We don't have to say, trust me, bro, like the Muslims do. We can simply say, hey, here's the evidence. Here's the evidence.
Right. Man,
Man.
that was good. That was good, Black Doc. That was good, man. Anytime you have these or anytime, bro, I would like to, if I'm not working and I like to join you and just soak up so much of this, bro. This is I mean, I'm almost speechless, bro. Like let me ask you a question.
Go ahead, fam.
If a normal Joe off the streets can find this information
Mm-hmm.
on the internet, why haven't scholarship caught up to this and just nip this in the bud? But I know it's biased to a certain point. But if they want to be true academics and be true to their respective works, they would let this be known. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
why do you think it's not?
Because the world in and of itself is against Christ. The biblical scholarship is not believing scholarship anymore. It's not, unfortunately. It's the academy has taken its eyes off of Jesus and therefore has destroyed itself. To where the thing that makes the most money is not adherence to biblical truth. It's basically saying, what do you write that'll turn the most heads and will cause the most scandal and will get the most people reading? Yellow journalism has become yellow scholarship. and
Yeah.
and we see this like with multitude of popular authors. Like who is the most popular textual critical scholar that a lot of people know today?
Bart Ehrman for the most part.
Bart Ehrman. And what is he most popularized for? His apostasy from
From
Christianity
Christianity.
and his popular writings on the new on the textual variants of the New Testament. Now,
Mm-hmm.
because of that popularity of both those facts, that he's an apostate and that he writes about textual criticism, what do people surmise is the reason for why he left Christianity?
Because he didn't believe that the Bibles is authentic, or or he lost his faith in because they're anonymous gospels. There's no way to
Mhm.
actually prove that these are actually historical documents or these people actually walked and talked with Jesus. That's what they believe.
Right. But is that true? Of course
No.
not. No, the reason why he left Christianity was because he couldn't square off the problem of evil. So it wasn't a factual thing, it was a personal problem. It was a personal problem. And so he uses his apostasy to portray lies or half truths against Christianity. But when you actually read Bart Ehrman's scholarly works, when you read his scholarly works, when you read him actually proving things that he actually believes, that is the historicity of Jesus, you get a whole different Bart Ehrman from him. A whole different Bart Ehrman. This is why you can get that same Bart Ehrman who says we don't know who wrote the New Testament, or we don't know what the New Testament actually says. In his
Mhm.
actual writings and in his actual debates, when people ask him straightforward questions, he says, the position that I argue for in misquoting Jesus is not different from Bruce Metzger's. The textual variance that we have in our tradition is not contrary to the actual doctrines that are found in the New Testament. When somebody asks him, well, what do you think the New Testament actually said? He says, pretty much what it says now. We're just tinkering with the text. When you get an honest Ehrman, you get a
Yeah.
Christian. But when you get an agnostic Ehrman, a popular Ehrman, you get an agnostic. That's the problem.
Yep.
Society is not based upon truth anymore. It's based on what gets the most money. And most people don't, most scholars, admittedly, don't see their inconsistencies there. They always believe that they're right. And so it's very hard to convince somebody that they're wrong. We see this with the Muslims all the time. They don't believe that they're wrong, and they don't care whether or not they're wrong, you know?
Right.
So, I mean, that's just going to be a reality. And this is what we have to deal with, unfortunately. But it's the reality of the situation. One thing that we must understand when it comes to scholarship is that the truth will prevail. It will.
Amen.
No matter how hard it takes, no matter how long it takes. Those who, what does Jesus say? Those who are of the truth, listen to him. His sheep will hear his voice. We can be confident that even that as Paul says, even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing.
Right.
So
Mm.
have confidence in the truth winning those whom God has ordained it will be. Have confidence.
Amen. That's good stuff right there. That's some good stuff.
Mm. Well,
Man.
I greatly appreciate you guys being here. Did you guys have any questions for me? Of course, you guys could put them all in the comment section if you could. I'm happy to answer them. But if there isn't anything else, I'm probably gonna head off. Wife's still at work, so I have some like free time to probably like rest. Because tomorrow I start my official start day as an intern at this church that I'm interning at. I'm really excited for it. It's going to be great. Lord willing, by the spring, I will be ordained as a deacon. So please be in prayer for me for that. It's going to be so good. But anyway, I hope that this has been absolutely amazing for you all. I hope you guys learned a lot. I hope you guys were edified by this, and that your the armor that God has given you has been strengthened, that your shield of faith has been strengthened, that your helmet of salvation has been shined, and that the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, looks all so brighter to you. Word and I, do you wanna have any closing comments before we leave?
No, I just want to keep everybody in good spirits and say, man, we see the fruits of what we've been doing, especially on the apologetic side, starting to really bear out. And I know we might talk to 200 of them, but as long as one of them see the truth, then we're not doing this in vain. And
Amen.
anyone out there, man, I see my big brother Scott, DL. Man, I met some amazing brothers, amazing Jai DOC. I mean, Life, Logic, brother Chris Claus. Man, like I'm so grateful that God put me in this position to where I got so many great, outstanding brothers and sisters in the faith that I can just lean on and
Mm,
glean from and learn from. And it has built me up magnificently. Like, y'all just don't know exactly like
mm.
what I've learned from y'all. And anybody out there, man, just keep it in the faith, keep it in the Bible, keep reading, keep studying, keep growing. No one knows everything, so just keep it up, man, and you're gonna see the fruits of your labor eventually. You know,
Amen.
he's not gonna leave you or forsake you,
Mm.
and that's all I got, man. And just keep, man, just come back to Black Doctor's channel if you want to learn deep theology. Man, this is the guy right here, man. I'm so grateful for this guy. I'm so grateful.
Bless you, brother. I really do appreciate you. All right. Well, so if you've really liked the content that I've given, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to support me, please make sure to follow my Patreon or go to my link tree where it has a lot of the places where you could donate to me and help support my ministry and support my family. Being married is a new challenge, which also leads to new responsibilities, and therefore it requires me to lean more upon the providence of God. So if you want to be the means that God uses to help support me and my wife and my ministry, please consider donating or anything like that. Any little bit counts. And you don't even have to. Just your thoughts and prayers is more than enough. For the prayers of a righteous man availeth much. You guys are awesome. I love you all. Please keep an eye out for this upcoming week. I have a whole bunch of videos and stuff coming out. Tomorrow is actually going to be a discussion that I had with a Muslim on whether or not Islam or Allah is a god of history. I really do think you guys will love that discussion. It was really sort of fun but frustrating for me. But it really shows the heart of Islam from either the highest scholar or the smallest scholar. So please keep an eye out for that. I have a whole bunch of other sermons coming out and a presentation on what every Christian needs to know about Islam. I gave that while I was in Florida in an internship. So I hope you guys enjoy. Aside from that, I hope you guys have a wonderful day and take care. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen.
Amen. I see you back, Doc. Appreciate you for having me.
Take care, brother.